So this one's a little bit different. I'm going to put it in the category of education videos, um, just because it's involving interesting historical topics. And this is by no means intended to be very, very comprehensive, but just some talking points. And I want to speak specifically about the Mongol conquests of the Middle Ages, and our perception of the Mongol conquest as well. I guess by our, I mean in the Western world, but let me start with an observation which is irrefutable. In modern day Mongolia, Genghis Khan is revered as a national hero. Now, Genghis Khan is surely one of the most important figures in world history. Um, I mean, he played a big role in shaping the world as we know it over time. Um, there were other examples, of course, in the ancient world. Alexander the Great comes to mind. But I want to sort of put out an open question here. If If we determine tyranny by body counts, then you would have to conclude that Genghis Khan and his heirs rank among the worst tyrants in history. And this is why. The world population in the 13th century was estimated to be about 350 million. There's some variation depending on the sources, but about 350 million. Now, the estimated death toll of the Mongol conquest over 2 centuries, it was over a long period, but over 2 centuries, is somewhere between 25 and 50 million. In other words, roughly 1/7 of the entire population of the world was killed in the Mongol conquests, or rather, 1 in 7, I should say. That's a staggering, staggering toll. Um, in modern times, we see the three great tyrants of the 20th century to be Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And there's extensive information available about all three, particularly about Hitler. In the case of Stalin and Mao, there is some sort of there's a sense of denial of rewriting of history, of censorship, particularly with Mao Zedong in China. I believe Mao was a complete tyrant responsible for tens of millions of preventable deaths, and there has been a lot of works that have been published but are banned in China. China still hasn't fully admitted the extent of the carnage that he caused. Um, But in proportion to world population, then Genghis Khan arguably has more blood on his hands than almost any other leader in history when you actually break it down to per capita rates. Because with Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, the world population was a lot bigger. Um, it's no vindication for what they've done, but and then with Hitler, it gets complicated. Do you associate deaths with Adolf Hitler to the Holocaust and to war crimes committed by the German army during World War II and for indeed starting the European war, or do you associate all war deaths with Hitler? Which I think would be pushing it because that then exonerates the Soviet forces from the massacres that they committed. Um, so the figures for Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, and this is very, very rough and of course subject to controversy, but the figure most associated with Hitler is 17 million. This is Jewish Holocaust deaths plus the millions of Slavs killed by German war crimes and many others, Blitzkrieg, for example. Stalin, the deaths associated with Stalin include the Holodomor in Ukraine, the Great Purge, and massacres in Eastern Europe by Soviet forces. And the deaths attributed to Mao include his absolutely catastrophic campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, internal purges, and communist atrocities during the Chinese Civil War. Um, so with Stalin and Mao, the figures go into tens of millions. Mao, in particular, was almost certainly the deadliest leader of the 20th century. Now, those who say I'm biased, yes, British prime ministers and American presidents also have blood on their hands. So, for example, if you associate Churchill with oppression in India or with the bombing of Dresden, then yes, Churchill has blood on his hands. If you associate American presidents with, let's say we take Richard Nixon and his campaign in, along with Lyndon Johnson in Indochina, that goes into about 4 million deaths. Without question, American presidents and British prime ministers also have blood on their hands, but it's nowhere near the sort of de facto total toll of a leader like Mao Zedong, a tyrant like Mao Zedong. And it's particularly chilling when you think almost all his victims were entirely internal. It makes you wonder just how much worse Mao would have been had he managed to build up the Chinese military to a point of invading other lands. I think the only reason that China didn't invade other countries at the time, there was several reasons for it, but it's simply because the Chinese military wasn't as strong as it is now. I mean, this was a country coming out of a brutal civil war. But anyway, getting back to the issue of the Mongols, there's no question about it. Genghis Khan was an inspiring leader. He was probably a great military leader, and there was a lot of personal hardship. You have to look at the context. This was a brutal time. There was no Geneva Convention. There was no Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So one could argue that all leaders at the time had to be brutal. You can see this throughout English history, indeed, throughout many of our medieval kings. So it was a brutal time which did require a degree of authoritarianism and a degree of ruthlessness. No question about that. But where Genghis Khan and his heirs went beyond simply getting revenge, for example, on the Tartars in the early years, they went to basically world conquest. I mean, the extent of the Mongol Empire was vast, the largest contiguous empire in history. The British Empire was larger in total area, but the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire in history, and virtually nowhere in the known world, that is, everywhere except the Americas, was untouched. Well, Africa, the Mongols didn't get into Africa, but pretty much most of Europe, all of Asia. Um, it was extensive, very, very, very extensive, and tens of millions died. Now, the argument that this was just, it was the standards of warfare of the time, even by the brutal standards of the time, the Mongol campaigns were absolutely ruthless. They didn't spare women and children, and the sort of vengeance crazed campaigns, for example, to rebuke a local governor or sultan or um, leader who would have refused their demands. The Mongols' answer was basically scorched earth, whole scale destruction, basically genocide, because the policy was to absolutely eradicate the enemy, so they didn't care less about women and children being included. Um, However, they weren't stupid. They also, in a way similar to Alexander the Great, also had a degree of integration. And later on, after Genghis Khan's death, for example, they integrated into Islam in Central Asia, ultimately ending up with the Islamic warlord Tamerlane, who, of course, claimed lineage from Genghis Khan. Um, and like many great figures in history, Genghis Khan has many contradictions. Ironically, the status of Mongol women was, for the time, quite advanced. Genghis personally had strong relations with women in his life, by contrast to other barbarians of the time, for example. Now, there's no question about it. All the warlike peoples of the ancient world were ruthless to an extent. You could take the Saxons, the Vikings, the Goths, certainly the Romans, um, ancient China, all of them. All these empires, all these powers used terror and violence to survive. It was the world as it was at that time. But the Mongols really took it to a new level. There's no denying that. And they also committed cultural vandalism that would, compare with anything that ISIS has done. As an example of this, they absolutely looted and destroyed the cities of Balkh and Herat in present-day Afghanistan, destroying the Persian culture there. In the campaign in Khwarezmia, exactly 800 years ago, that was roughly from 1218 to 1221. Um, it's estimated about 1.5 million people died. That's a region covering present-day northern Iran and Uzbekistan. So, what's my point with this? Am I saying we should judge Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and Ogedai Khan and Tamerlane by today's standards? No, it was a very different world. Um, and ruthless conquest was something that was part and parcel of the world at that time. One could argue if Genghis hadn't done it, someone else would have. But if we are going to look at judging empires, for example, then it strikes me as interesting that those who vilify the British Empire and lambast the British Empire don't seem to hold the same standards to Mongol conquest. If the British exploited and killed in our quest for world domination, the Mongols done the same. Um, I mean, such was the destruction that the Mongols wrought in parts of the Eastern Islamic world. The destruction was so intense that it can still be seen today. You can see the ruins of ancient mosques and ancient Islamic shrines from the Mongol conquests. So there's no doubt about it. Genghis Khan and his heirs shaped the world. But I think the Mongols today perhaps need to be a bit more honest about the fact this was a man of blood. This was a man whose forces committed basically genocide in some places. I mean, the urban sieges were extremely bloody, Baghdad, Moscow, and this extended all the way from Japan to Eastern and Central Europe, um, east to west, and from Sakhalin in Russia right down to Java in Indonesia. So this was pretty much the whole known world except for Africa and Australasia. And they didn't get to the British Isles. Of course, we had the Vikings to contend with. But anyway, it's just something to think about. And I will put a link on this video to a documentary, Barbarians, Mongols. It was a series on different barbarian groups. Um, by the way, I'm not saying that Genghis personally was responsible for all the bloodshed of the Mongol conquests. His tenure as Khan, as Great Khan, actually was a relatively small portion of that. We're talking about a period of roughly 200 years, from roughly 1205 to 1406. That's very, very loose. And of that, Genghis's campaigns lasted about 20 or 30 years. So a lot of it should also be ascribed to his heirs. But I do think that when Genghis Khan is romanticized, as is often the case today, we cannot forget this was a man who, along with his heirs, ruthlessly slaughtered maybe millions of men, women, and children. And by the way, that's the massacres and battles. That isn't even including the millions likely who died from disease. All of this at a time when the world population was much, much smaller than it is today. So it should never be forgotten that basically the Mongol conquests were among the absolute bloodiest events in human history.